Now, today we're joined by a wonderful group of experts. First, we have Susan Fratzke. She's a senior policy analyst with the MPI's international program based in Germany. She specializes in asylum policy, forced migration, refugee resettlement. Her research on refugee pathways and sponsorship has been widely cited in international policy circles. Previously, she worked for the U.S. Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, and she holds an MA in German and European Studies from Georgetown University with expertise in European migration policy. Then we're lucky to have Victoria Rietig here, who has been working in the field of migration and asylum for over 20 years. She's been leading the migration program at DGAP since 2019, following her roles at the Migration Policy Institute and Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C., and the United Nations Institute for Training and Research in New York. She holds a master's in public policy from Harvard University, specializing on human trafficking and forced migration. And the discussion will be moderated not by me, by our very own researcher at the Migration Department, Liam Haller, who has done a lot of work on German asylum system and refugees in Germany, looking at a variety of things, among which processes of naturalization, accommodation, and migration decision-making. He's also uniquely placed to moderate this discussion as a researcher from the US. And I don't want to hold up too much of your time, just on the process a little bit and housekeeping rules that we have. As you might have noticed already, the discussion will be filmed, but only until the Q&A session. In this time, we will only be showing basically the guests and the moderators, so no one who has not signed up for it will be shown, and the Q&A will not be filmed. We first have a panel discussion, as I just mentioned, so this will be about 30 to 40 minutes. This will be followed by an open Q&A. There are two ways in which you can ask your questions in this Q&A. Either you can raise your hand at the end of the panel discussion and directly address your question to the panelists, or you can use the general chat function, or you can just, if you want it to be in an anonymized form, you can private message me, and I will just put this into the sort of bulk of questions that we would be receiving. I will try to collect and cluster all these questions and then ask them to the guest, but obviously depending on the number of questions, it might be that we don't come to all of the questions. And again, I will try to do a thematic clustering before I raise them. That will be it from my side. On that note, I give the word now to Liam, who will be moderating the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. So I want to first start off by talking or focusing specifically on the US and kind of give a broad overview of what we've seen essentially in Trump's first 30 or so days in office. During his campaign and immediately when he arrived in office, he made very clear that immigration and migration were two of his top priorities. On his first day, he signed a total of 34 policies and executive orders. 27 of these policies were revised orders that he had implemented during his first presidency, but 7 of these that we're seeing now were actually unprecedented. Among the topics that he's touched upon were expanding detention and deportation practices, increased scrutiny for all visas, promoting third country asylum, and in some cases, DNA testing for migrants as well. With the new policies, we're also seeing him go to different vectors with which he's actually enforcing these new changes. So talking about things like deploying the military to the border in order to declare it as specifically an invasion, seeking to end birthright citizenship, and then clawing back funding from different migrant organizations that operate in kind of across the spectrum: refugee and asylum, work visas, and integration processes. With this flurry of executive orders and policies, for someone who's even a well-informed reader, it's fairly difficult to keep up with kind of the pace of all these changes. Susan, I was hoping that you may be able to kind of start us off and give us a broad overview of what you see as kind of the key areas of change that we've seen under Trump in this new presidency, and maybe kind of forecast what some of the consequences of these might be.
Great. Thanks, Liam. Very happy to kick off and very happy to be here. I'm looking forward to the discussion. So I think, as Liam said, there is really a lot that the Trump administration has done in their first now month in office. But we know already from the first Trump administration that this is an administration that really likes to be seen to be doing a lot of things, but then you have to really look below the surface to figure out whether or not the actions that they're taking really have had an effect on the ground. So there's a lot of show, and then whether or not something is actually having an effect is often an open question. So I'd like to maybe talk about three different categories of changes that they've made. So one, the actions they've taken that are already having an immediate effect on migrants and immigration in the United States. And then changes they've made that have had an effect, but the effect hasn't been as significant or as large as they want you to believe. And then changes that really have had no impact yet. So in the first bucket, changes that have already had an effect on the ground, I would include here things like halting the U.S. resettlement program. So one of the things that Trump did on his first day in office was to stop refugee resettlement to the United States. And that's something that lies very much within the executive branch. That's something that he can do on his own. And it had an immediate impact. So refugees are no longer being resettled into the United States. The agencies that support them are no longer getting funding. It's had a very clear effect. There are people who, for example, Afghans who supported the US military who are now stranded in Pakistan. The other thing that they did immediately was halt the humanitarian admissions programs that the Biden administration created in the Americas. So this includes the Safe Mobility Offices, SMOs, which are these offices that were created to give a place for refugees and asylum seekers in Colombia and Guatemala and elsewhere to apply for resettlement to the United States. And another program called the Cuban, Haitian, Nicaraguan, and Venezuelan Parole Program, which was like a humanitarian visa program for those nationalities that the Biden administration had put in place. Those have also ceased to exist. So overall, there's been a big move to stop legal humanitarian pathways into the United States. They've also halted U.S. contributions to international agencies, including the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and the International Organization for Migration. And they have also taken a few unusual actions that are quite new. So this includes returning returning individuals with removal orders, so people who have an order to return to a third country. This is sort of similar to what's been discussed in the European space as a return hub. So they've begun returning people to Costa Rica, Mexico, Panama, El Salvador, and Guatemala who aren't actually nationals of those countries. And they've also begun moving people to the US military base at Guantanamo. It's worth noting that for both of those measures, the people who they are moving are not actually asylum seekers or people who have filed asylum claims, but are people who just have an order to return. So they aren't doing external asylum processing or anything like that. This is really much more a holding space for people who they can't return. The second bucket of actions are ones that have really had an effect on the ground, but it's not as big as they want you to believe. So here in the election campaign, Trump made a lot of noise about doing mass deportations of people who were in the United States without authorization. And they were able to increase the numbers of people who they were arresting immediately after he took office. So they were able to arrest about 1,200 people per day around the end of January. But the numbers that they've been arresting since then have really fallen off as they've gotten through the cases who are a lot easier to arrest and deport. So like people with known criminal histories. And as of right now, with the latest available data, it looks like they're only arresting about 600 people per day, which is very much lower than the goal that they had stated on the campaign trail. Detention capacity in the US is also almost full, and the Immigration Enforcement Agency, which is called ICE in the United States, is almost out of money. So it seems like it's unlikely they'll be able to keep this pace up. They had set themselves a goal of more like 1,600 cases per day. So it seems like they aren't going to be able to continue to meet that or to really fulfill their mass deportation pledge. The numbers of people that they're actually removing from the United States are also so far lower than the Biden administration, partly because they've been focusing more on removing people from inside of the country, which is much more difficult. And it's also not clear that they've accomplished very much in terms of their negotiations with partner countries. So they've made a big deal of these these negotiations that they've had with places like Colombia to try to force them to take back more of their nationals. Colombia, Panama, and many of these countries were already taking back their nationals who were being returned from the United States. And the conflicts that they've had with the Biden administration have more been about the way in which people are being returned. So, sorry, the Trump administration, not the Biden administration. But the Trump administration has, for example, pushed to return people in handcuffs or used military planes to return people. And the countries of origin have really objected to that. So it's been more about the style rather than whether people or not people are going back in the first place. They've also taken some measures to halt asylum at the border, to try to return people to Mexico and get Mexico to use their military to keep people from moving through Mexico to the United States. Again, a lot of that really duplicates policies that were put in place by the Biden administration. Mexico was already using its military to keep people from crossing into the United States. And the estimates right now are that nearly 300,000 people are actually stuck in Mexico and waiting to see whether or not they will continue their journeys on to try to enter the United States or not. So it's possible that, like we saw under the first Trump administration, you might have numbers of people crossing at the border right now that are quite low, and those may go up then later on. Finally, there's a number of things they've done that actually haven't had an impact. One of these is the move to change U.S. citizenship policy. This was done in an executive order. It's part of the U.S. Constitution that someone who is born to the United States gets U.S. citizenship, even if they don't have a legal status in the United States. So it's unlikely that that will stand after it's challenged in courts. It's going through the courts right now. He's also, as Liam mentioned, deployed the military to the U.S. border. The number of people who are crossing the U.S. border from Mexico is very low right now. They aren't actually doing much of anything. There's a lot of reports of members of the U.S. military really sort of standing around without anything to do. And the final thing just to mention is they've also ordered a review of U.S. treaty obligations. And so we're still waiting to see what effect that's likely to have, but it could affect things like the U.S. membership in the UN Refugee Convention, for example.
It sounds to me like of these three buckets, then the first bucket is where most of the impact is, kind of withdrawing aid from these different countries and kind of dismantling this bureaucracy, whereas some of the other executive orders may ultimately end up being more kind of bark than bite if there's no legislation behind them. Could you talk maybe a little bit about the long-term ramifications of withdrawing this aid? For, let's say, a new president who enters office after, would it be as easy as kind of a new executive order to like let aid flourish again? Or are there going to be long-term consequences from actually dismantling this bureaucracy?
Yeah, so I think that's right. Where the president has the most space to maneuver is really on humanitarian policy in many ways. The changes to the U.S. resettlement program and U.S. international aid have the potential to be quite significant in the long term. We saw this under the first Trump administration, where they cut resettlement into the United States, which meant also less money going to the international agencies and the U.S. agencies helping refugees on the ground. Those agencies then had to lay off staff, close offices, and it actually took a long time, so several years after the Biden administration came into office, to rebuild some of that infrastructure. The impact is likely to be more significant this time because they've also cut humanitarian assistance that goes through the UN Refugee Agency and humanitarian assistance that was coming from USAID. Under Trump 1, that had been left intact. So you'll see more widespread impacts, I think, of the cut in funding. In terms of the other measures that they've taken where the impact is a little bit less significant, I think the main threat is that they have really prioritized short-term gains over long-term relationships, particularly with their partner countries. So they've wanted to be seen as being very forceful on immigration policy. And that means that they are taking a stance that is really much more hardline and transactional than the Biden administration did. And I think that has the potential to undermine U.S. relationships with countries, particularly in Latin America, over the longer term.
It seems to me as under Trump 2.0 now, there's no holding back in terms of what tools will actually be used to accomplish these goals. Victoria, I had a question for you about kind of the methods with which Trump is using to kind of deploy these actions. Susan had touched upon third country partners, kind of these bully tactics that we hadn't really seen before, but not really holding back using now. I was wondering if you could touch a little bit upon that.
Sure, happy to. So one of the main methods with which Trump has been acting are, of course, the executive orders, but that is absolutely not new. That is a tendency that we've seen over various presidencies in the last decade now. I think it started under Obama, and every president since then has kind of ramped up the number of executive orders on migration that they've put into place. I think Biden was at something like 400 or even higher than that. And Trump is clearly trying to kind of outdo him again in this round. And the reason for that is, of course, that we haven't had comprehensive immigration reform, that Congress is completely stalled and has been stalled on migration for, I want to say, more than 20 years now. And that is simply, and that brings us into the situation where you have so much power in the executive branch, not just because, it's a presidential system, but really because the legislative branch has been incapable of doing anything and has been blocked for so long that the executive branch has kind of done a power grab, and is only now controlled somewhat by the judicative, so by the courts. And that, of course, is getting more and more in question in how much that actually is a check or balance given the Supreme Court's, political tilt at this point. So that's kind of executive actions. But if you, as one of the methods, and there's other methods, but before I get into that, I would love to comment a little bit on the great things that Susan has already said and the good points, because I agree very much with these three buckets, and I think they're very well cut. There's literally just one part where I was thinking that one of the elements doesn't belong into the second bucket of small effect, but really in the first bucket of immediate effect and potentially big effect. And that is the halting of asylum at the border. The end of asylum at the border, really, as we've known it, is, in my view, a pretty big thing that we already see in the numbers. As you may know, the government suspended the CBP-1 app, which was the last way left to claim asylum legally at the border. Claiming asylum between the points of entry already had been made much, much harder, close to impossible under Biden. And this has had an immediate effect on the numbers that we do see. Just this morning, actually, CBP published the numbers for January, and we do see that they've really dipped down much further. They're now at 61,000 apprehensions just in the month of January. That's down from about 100,000 in the last monthly in the last quarter of 24. And it might fall even further. So you do see that immediate impact there. You also see this in the numbers in Mexico because Comar, the Mexican asylum agency, has reported a jump in asylum applications in January. So compared to 2024, the numbers have tripled in some places. And that very much aligns with what Susan said about people being stuck in Mexico and some of them just getting used to staying there for a longer time. So that's why remains to be seen the longer term impact, but I would say that these numbers actually point to an immediate effect, and therefore I would put it in that bucket number one. If you allow me, I'd also like to comment just a little bit on the mass deportations and the kind of deportations to holding centers, return hubs, transit detention places, whatever label you put on it, both to Guantanamo and also to the Central American countries, because, as Susan rightfully said, that to the European mind is kind of closest to what we are thinking about, and we're now seeing this play out in real time. So one word on Guantanamo. The US has long been using this military base in Guantanamo for very different purposes. In Germany, we mostly know of it because of the infamous holding of terrorists and alleged terrorists post 9/11, but the US already used this base to bring, for instance, Haitians there in the 1990s, and then later also Cubans, and not in small numbers. So in the early 90s, there were more than 10,000 people that were just held there, 10,000 migrants waiting kind of to be processed and potentially returned to their country. So I want to point out how this is really not a new, but a continued practice. Just on what's happening in Guantanamo right now, we know that the US has brought at least 7 military planes there with around 100 detained migrants to Guantanamo. They usually go from Fort Bliss, which is in close to El Paso. It's a military base there, and then they fly to Guantanamo. And the declared goal is to get to 30,000 people there. And so far, interestingly, all the people that have been removed there are Venezuelans. Why? Because they are so hard to deport otherwise, because of the lack of diplomatic relationships with Venezuela. And the US government has claimed in social media that these are mostly hardened criminals belonging to a gang called Tren de Aragua, but media reporting already has tracked down a few of the family members, and there you see some evidence that perhaps not all of these people are actually criminals. Some of them are held in these actually military camps that were set up and that were used also for the detainees that were suspected to be terrorists, but some are also housed in tents. So we know that tent camps have gone up on the military base. So that's the situation right now. Lawyers are struggling to get access. It's a very much what I call a gray zone, or a gray site, not a black site, but a gray site. It's just, we just don't know. So that's on Guantanamo. And on the Central American countries, I've watched the press conference of the Panamanian government and also followed reporting on that quite closely. This morning, there was another good article in the New York Times explaining what has happened. And so far, for instance, 300 people have been deported to Panama just in the last few days. And the Panamanian government has announced that already 170 of those people have agreed now to be brought back to their home countries. And the remainder of the people they are planning on bringing to a site in the jungle near the Darien Gap route to wait until they've decided where they want to claim asylum. So they're clearly trying to make the situation, to shape the situation in a way that there's a huge incentive for these people to go back to their countries, or to agree to go back, agree in parentheses, of course. There was another point which escapes me now, so I'll just have a full stop here because I think I've been speaking for a long time.
No, lovely. Thank you very much. Susan, maybe one last question for you on the topic of US policy and legislation. I'm curious for your perspective on, Victoria had mentioned that a lot of these practices that we're seeing or maybe are implemented that are escalating are actually continued practices that had been kind of done before and maybe on a larger scale now. Do you view these policies and maybe the sentiment of the American people in this case as a gradual kind of increase over the time? Or is what we're seeing today actually a sharp break in terms of policy, but also kind of the will of the American people and kind of their beliefs about what should be done with migration and immigration in the country?
It's a good question, and it's a tricky one to answer. I think after having lived through the last 3 elections, I'm not sure if anyone can really know what's in the minds of the American people at the moment. But I think there are maybe a couple of things to keep in mind. Like Victoria said, the use of Guantanamo isn't necessarily new, but when it was used in the past, generally people were allowed to claim asylum. There were still issues with access by civil society organizations, but there was a resettlement program out of Guantanamo, and it was done with the aim of stopping irregular migration, but also there was a humanitarian component to it. And so the use that it's being put to now, I think, is even more sort of a borderline in terms of what's actually legal. And the same thing is true with Panama, for example. They've been cooperating with the US for a long time as well and doing deportations, but it was a much more targeted arrangement. So what we're seeing right now is really a much things that the government is now willing to do without a lot of guardrails and without even sort of a semblance of compliance with international law or human rights. I think that what we have seen over the last, this last election in particular, with regard to how people view migration, is in some ways a reaction to, migration was a highly salient issue before, but in some ways a reaction to the Biden administration policies. I would like to believe, and I think this is to some extent supported by polling, that most people in the United States aren't paying a lot of attention to the details of how immigration is done. They see big news articles about the number of people who have been arriving, who were arriving under the Biden administration, and the number was quite high, and historically very high for the United States. and they see the effects in their communities. And there were real effects of the Biden administration policies on local communities. So school districts not having the resources to provide English language training, housing being at capacity. There were sort of real local effects that people did see. But what I'd like to believe is, once some of the policies that the Trump administration is now putting in place that have the potential to be quite cruel, once those things hit the news, there may be a bit of a backlash. You see even in, except for the sort of the hardest line people of the administration, you do still continue to see people pay lip service to legal immigration and immigration for work purposes, which is similar to what we hear on the European side a lot as well, is that except for sort of the hardest line parties, people still are willing to speak about the importance of legal immigration. We'll see if that plays out. I do think and hope that there is still support for legal immigration in the United States, and that there may be something of a backlash to some of these policies when the really cruel consequences are borne out. I think that's most likely to be the case for some of these deportation policies, some of the things that are happening at the border. Of course, Guantanamo, that's likely to happen mostly out of view of the public. I don't know what the reaction to that will be. But I think this is for the time being, at least, I won't say a short-term trend. I think it's part of a pendulum swing, and we may see the pendulum perhaps not swing all the way back, but move a little bit closer to the middle, I hope.
Thank you. Yeah. Speaking of kind of this European context that you had mentioned, and maybe like a pendulum or on a global scale, Victoria, I wanted to get your thoughts about how you see U.S. migration policy and actions affecting debates within Europe and around Europe. Recently, you had written a piece about how the U.S. election itself actually was kind of permeating into German migration debates. I'm curious to see if you have any updated changes or thoughts actually after Trump presidency, and also kind of from what yourself and Susan had discussed before, whether you see any parallels within the German context with the upcoming election in these election manifestos, the policies themselves that are actually being put forward.
Yeah. Thank you. Happy to comment on that. And I'm putting the paper that I wrote on that. It's just a small piece on the effects of kind of the US election or US migration policies on Germany here in the chat, in case people are interested. The main point I'm making there is that US migration policy has an impact on our debate, but it's really not just that. It's always kind of had an effect on our debate, but it also has an effect on German citizens. So that's a second D, Deutsche, and it has an effect on actual migration pressure, so Migrationsdruck is a third D in Germany, and that is really a more recent development of the last few years. That there's a direct linkage between the migration pressures at the U.S.-Mexico border because there is such a changed composition of people arriving there. But I'll first say something on the debate. So I think that especially when it comes to deportations, mass deportations, and deporting people to countries that aren't their countries of origin, I think there has been a lot of imitation happening in the European context from the US. It's not only driven by the US, but there I see kind of the greatest parallels, and also where I know European policymakers are very interested in seeing how the US's methods are working out, because as I said earlier, and as Susan also pointed out, this is kind of the return hub idea come to life overnight. And they can now see kind of what kind of pressures have worked well towards these countries. I think in the hopes to be able to replicate something like that. So the conversation, and we see that also play out in the electoral programs. We've done a big analysis of the electoral programs of the main parties, and we do see a hardening both in rhetoric and in concepts. So you very much have concepts that are kind of pushing the legal boundaries and overstepping the legal boundaries in a lot of what leading political parties in Germany are demanding and are promising voters after the election. And we do see that there is kind of a hunger for that in the European public. So if you combine the projected votes for those parties that actually favor a harsher migration policy to the one that we have currently, you do see that we have more than 6 in 10 people intending to vote for a party that makes these promises, and that pushes our boundaries quite a lot further. One more point perhaps on this new development in the last few years, that I think our migration pressures are more linked now than in the past. The information that a lot of people in Germany haven't seen yet, I mean, we're in an expert room, so I presume you guys have seen it somewhat, but that really politicians are unaware of, and most people that don't deal with migration on a daily basis aren't aware of, is that the migratory flows at the US-Mexico border have become so much more diversified in the last 5 to 10 years. And there's been a big shift, especially in the last 5 years, because we have a new migration route through the Darien Gap, so the little piece of land that connects Colombia with Panama. And because we've seen this route that used to see a few thousand people a year and is now seeing, or has seen now, up to 500,000 people a year, because we have that connection, you now have flows essentially going out of Asia, Africa, and Europe into Southern America, and then making their way through the Darien Gap to Central America and then the United States. And that means that in return, now that the border between the US and Mexico is hardened again, or more hardened even than under Biden, I do presume that a lot of these migration pressures are going back not just into Mexico and Latin America, but really will kind of move back into the rest of the world, including Asian, African countries, really our direct neighborhood of Europe. And so we are going to feel, I think, in the coming years, some of that pressure also land in Europe. Very important to say it's some of that pressure, right? You all know it's not, one-to-one squeezing of the balloon and then everyone goes to this other place. But we do see that when one border hardens, people don't disappear, they go somewhere else. And that somewhere else, in this case, and for the first time really in our history, is really this transoceanic migratory flows that have increased in number to quite substantial degree.
I get the sense from what you're saying too, that as migration routes themselves become more interconnected, sentiment also becomes more interconnected, and that global populace is kind of maybe developing similar feelings at similar times. Would that be a fair takeaway from that point?
You could make that point, but I would rather say, is it really the routes that make the difference, or is it the same social media we're using? So I would say that migration sentiment, especially amongst hardliners or people that wish for more hardline migration policies, is, I think, influenced a lot more through kind of how social media functions. And here I would rather say that because we've had the kowtowing of important social media companies to the Trump administration with less fact-checking and kind of, less controls, I would say that has an impact on our migration debate in Germany, and therefore kind of contributes to this, loosening of rhetoric or hardening of rhetoric, depending on which side of the aisle you are.
Very fair. Thank you. Yeah. Susan, I wanted to get your thoughts as well on some of the parallels that you may draw between kind of the US context and what we see with kind of broader migration debates in Europe as well. And maybe kind of when you touch upon this, another question that I had for you was a distinction in terms of what Victoria said of kind of this copycat behavior of politicians in Europe looking to the US. To what extent are they drawing on it, feeling emboldened, but why they see kind of succeed, or to what extent is this actually kind of rising within Europe itself?
Great questions. Maybe just to add one thing quickly at the top to what Victoria was mentioning around the potential for flows to shift. I completely agree with that. I would add just that I think in addition to so in the US context, these are called extracontinentals, so people who have come from outside the Americas to claim asylum in the United States coming up through the Darien. So in addition to people from outside the Americas who switch to Europe to try to seek asylum or seek protection, I think there's another potential way in which in which flows could actually shift from the Americas to Europe as well, and that's around asylum seekers from Latin America as well. So the United States, of course, in addition to the extracontinental migrants, the largest asylum-seeking groups are individuals from Central America and from South America, including Colombians and Venezuelans. And Colombians and Venezuelans right now are among the top nationalities seeking asylum in Europe, and many Latin American countries also continue to have visa-free travel to Europe. And I don't know that we've seen a shift in terms of where people are going yet, but it's possible that you could also see a shift in terms of where individuals from Latin America as well are looking for protection and looking to seek asylum. So yeah, just to add that dimension as well. In terms of the normative impacts and sort of how the U.S. Behaviors are affecting discussions in Europe and vice versa. And I think I completely agree with what Victoria said. A lot of what's happening is narratives and stories and events getting shared across the Atlantic on social media and on mainstream media that really create a lot of the same reactions. I think many of the dynamics as well that we've seen around migration over the last 10 years are quite similar between the US context and the European context in terms of the rise of irregular and mixed migration flows, the increasing sophistication of smuggling networks. A lot of the public opinion research that has been done on migration and public opinion views on migration points to the fact that for many people, what's really important and salient, and this is not just in the US, but also in European countries, is the way in which people are arriving and whether people are arriving in a way that's sort of planned and orderly or seems really spontaneous and chaotic. And this sort of shift to what's perceived as these flows is something that's common to both the Americas and the European context, and that's getting picked up and made more visible on mainstream media and social media, and really amplifying the public reactions, I think. And then, of course, we've definitely seen policy transfer and policy travel between the Americas and Europe. And I think not just going from what the US and what Trump have done to Europe, but also back the other way. So under the Biden administration, as they worked towards this suite of policies that they put into place the last 2 years of the Biden government, they actually drew a lot of inspiration from things that Europe has tried. So they were looking quite closely at the Dublin system. They looked at also the ECTHR ruling in Ceuta and Melilla that said that you could legally push people back between ports of entry if there was a way for someone to claim asylum legally at a port of entry. That was a specific judgment that they used that sort of inspired their approach. So I think it's not just policy travel happening from the Americas to Europe, but also going back the other way. And I would expect that we'll see that continue under the Trump administration, given the close contacts that the people who are in that government have with some of the parties that are really much more hardline here in the European space.
Thank you. Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. One quick thought, and then Victoria, if you'd like a moment to respond quickly after. I'll take advantage of my position as moderator. But yeah, I couldn't agree more. I very much so feel aligned with what you said of this idea of spontaneity and the responses to spontaneity. Just thought as well that I see a lot of the policy over the next 4 years, or maybe kind of going forward, this idea of an illusion of control, right? Kind of no matter what is actually done on the ground, people like to feel as if or perceive as if whatever happening is orderly. Whether that exists or not, putting that perception out there, I find is kind of the main focus or one of the primary focuses of actually kind of this flurry or blitz of legislation that we're seeing. But Victoria, please, would you like to comment? And then I might just say to everyone else after this comment, I'll open up the discussion to questions from the audience. Feel free to raise your hand and ask it directly, or if you'd like as well, you can ask it in the chat, but please go ahead.
Thanks. I just wanted to add one more point where actually the learning, I agree with Susan on that, goes from Europe to the US, not vice versa, or the copying, and that is citizenship, right? I mean, interestingly, citizenship law is really one of the few areas where the US at current and even under Trump and even what he wants is less extreme than European countries, because giving citizenship only to children with at least one parent legally in the country is the norm in Europe, right? I mean, that's already been generous compared to what we had 20 years ago, right? So, but in the US context, it is perceived as very extreme because of the history of giving birthright citizenship, and of course because of the history of the 14th Amendment, which didn't have to do anything with migration, but really had all to do with the abolishment of slavery and making African Americans full citizens of the country. And so I think that is why this is such an emotionally charged subject in the US, where you know, you have you had this immediate, very strong reaction to the executive action on that. But when it comes to the policy content, it's actually not one that I think we would consider extreme. It's more, I said that to a colleague the other day, that's actually quite, in Germany, that would be a properly, you know, social democratic view on what citizenship should look like. And I think that's kind of funny to think that Scholz and Trump would have something in common.
Very fair. I think funny is well said indeed. I'll open it up to the audience. As kind of one concluding thought, bringing us all the way back to the very beginning, what Susan had said with kind of these three buckets, looking at different ways to kind of categorize our effects. My hope or thought would be that kind of whatever happens within this next governing coalition, it will ultimately be more difficult to revoke humanitarian aid or to kind of make these like large changes that Trump was able to do because he has kind of full control over the federal policy. And so no matter how they shape out, kind of what we're categorizing as the most kind of extreme immediate effects will likely be less than kind of what we see in the United States. So I'll kind of give that as a small silver lining as well. I'd like to thank both of our speakers today, Susan Fratzke and Victoria Rietig. And then I would like to thank everyone who joined us here today as well. And with that, I will conclude our meeting. Thank you both.
Thanks so much, Liam. Thanks everyone for joining in.